Chapter 4 of the National Development Plan, titled Economic Infrastructure. This chapter lays out the economic infrastructure related goals that the country in 2012 aimed to achieve by 2030. This economic infrastructure refers to the physical and organizational structures or infrastructure which enable economic and social development in the country. Key categories of economic infrastructure that might give you a bit of a sense of what economic infrastructure is include electricity, water, transport, and telecommunications related infrastructure. No electricity means no lights. No water means compromised sanitation. No transport means no movement of goods or people. And no telephone or internet networks means limited communication for everyone. Economic infrastructure is therefore clearly the backbone, the skeleton, or the primary structure on which the country and every citizen's economic and social development occurs. The state, as the primary custodian of how our country works to serve its citizens, has the responsibility to ensure that economic infrastructure is not only accessible and reliable for all, but importantly, is affordable. Of the 7 economic infrastructure related goals that we have isolated and which the government aimed to achieve by 2030 as articulated in the National Development Plan, 2 are on track to being achieved. What exactly are these goals? And what's the progress towards each of them? And what are the strengths and weaknesses in the state's implementation and working toward the achievement of these goals? With the assistance of a dashboard that I've compiled, which you can access via the link in the description of this video, we'll begin to answer some of these important questions. With that said, let's get into it. Chapter 4 of the National Development Plan, Economic Infrastructure. In this video here today, we'll begin by looking at the structure of Chapter 4, then dive into some of the key takeaways from the different sections of this chapter, and finally look closely at the National Development Plan targets and the progress toward them as laid out in this chapter. Just to remind you where we are in this National Development Plan series, in Part 1, we went through the first 2 chapters of the National Development Plan, which were introductory and context setting in their nature. Then, in Part 2, we look closely at Chapter 3, titled Economy and Employment, and outlined its contents as well as the progress toward the targets which it set out. Today, again, we're on Chapter 4, titled Economic Infrastructure. Over 7 sections, this chapter lays out the plan for ensuring that the foundational economic infrastructure required to enable the nation to realize its economic and social goals is in place. The 4 main categories of economic infrastructure that are delved into in this chapter are 1, the energy sector, which encompasses the electricity and liquid fuels that power our homes, workplaces, and cars. Number 2, water resources and services, which is all the key water-related infrastructure. Number 3, transport, which includes all infrastructure related to moving people and products. And number 4, information and communications infrastructure, which is the infrastructure that allows for our wireless and digital connection, from your ability to call people, connect to the internet, and even watch TV. Let's touch on what the National Development Plan tells us about the state of each of these categories in 2012 and then the envisioned way forward for each of them as it was defined in 2012. Regarding the country's energy sector, the state envisioned a South Africa where everyone would have access to reliable and affordable energy, and that a significant proportion of the country's energy would be clean energy with a minimal carbon footprint. That was the high-level vision in 2012. But what did South Africa's energy landscape look like in 2012? Well, to begin with, South Africa was and is a mixed energy economy, meaning that there's a mix of public and private sector ownership, operation, and investment in energy-related infrastructure, with varying levels of public versus private activity in different parts of this energy ecosystem. The key areas of the energy system or ecosystem in South Africa can be thought of as a pyramid, with primary energy or raw material for making energy at the top of the pyramid and feeding into the production of 2 categories of secondary energy, the first being electricity and the second being liquid fuels. Of the primary energy that feeds into making electricity and liquid fuels, 70% of it was coal. Of the electricity that was produced at the bottom of the pyramid, 90% was made from coal. This is back in 2012. And of the liquid fuels, also at the bottom of the pyramid, a third were made from coal. From this, we clearly see that the country's energy sector was heavily dependent on coal. Additionally, in 2012, the energy sector was characterized by an unreliable supply of electricity and liquid fuels, with electricity generation monopolized by Eskom, which had no competition. Frequent load shedding was also characteristic of the electricity landscape at the time. Toward making electricity and liquid fuels more accessible, reliable, affordable, and clean, the state in 2012 prioritized improving competition in electricity generation and stabilizing the reliability of coal supply by improving railway infrastructure and operations. Additionally, the state prioritized developing cleaner sources of energy to reduce the heavy reliance on coal and high level of carbon emissions. Regarding water resources and services on a high level, by 2030, the NDP aimed to ensure that there would be reliable and affordable water supply for all, minimal wastage through leaky pipes, and that within government, the institutional structures and skills required to manage water resources and services would be well established and in place. Key characteristics of South Africa's water landscape in 2012 included the fact that South Africa was and is a water scarce country, ranked 148 out of 180 countries in terms of water availability per capita. While demand for water was growing rapidly at the time, infrastructure investment was simply inadequate. And there was growing concern that the state at the time simply did not have the required institutional structures to deliver on large-scale water infrastructure projects. Additionally, the increasing shortage of water engineers, scientists, and capable managers within the water space was highlighted as a serious cause for concern in the NDP. At the time, this state of affairs resulted in weak institutions, including at a local government level, which were just unable to deliver clean water reliably across the country. Insufficient and unreliable water infrastructure was also identified as a primary challenge which was manifesting at that time. To address these challenges, in 2012, the National Development Plan prioritized interventions to reduce demand for water, improve supply of water, and strengthen the capability and capacity of the government's workforce within the water infrastructure space. When looking at the infrastructure required to transport people and goods into, out of, and across the country, the overarching objectives for 2030 were to, number one, improve geographic accessibility for all. Number two, ensure that there is a reliable logistics network to enable economic growth. Number three, improve the accessibility and use of low carbon transports such as electric or biofuel powered vehicles. And number four, ensure that transport related state institutions such as Transnet and the Department of Transport are capable of delivering on their mandates. The transport infrastructure in South Africa includes everything to do with roads, rails, air, seaports, and pipelines. In 2012, the transport infrastructure was characterized as being poorly maintained and operated, with our ports performing poorly relative to global benchmarks, and the primary bottleneck for mineral exports out of the country being an inadequate rail network. So, for example, if you had a coal mine that was capable of mining 100 tons of coal per month, you may only be able to export 60 tons of coal per month for no reason other than the fact that the rail network was underperforming and just couldn't accommodate your coal. Poor transport infrastructure, maintenance, and operations therefore stifled and continue to this day to stifle key areas of economic activity and growth in our country. Additionally, the inadequate improvement of public transport systems reinforced the spatial inequality initially orchestrated by the apartheid structuring of cities, which placed non white people furthest away from areas of economic activity, increasing the time and resources these groups had to spend to access these areas of economic opportunity. This spatial inequality and inequality in general is still a stark reality in our country today. To address these challenges, the National Development Plan committed the government in 2012 to number one, increase infrastructure investment, number two, devolve or bring down transport management to the local municipality level to improve localized coordination in delivery of transport related projects. Number three, better incentivize public transport use by providing public transport that has coverage, affordability, and a safety profile which would make using public transport preferable to driving. The fourth and final economic infrastructure category is information and communications infrastructure. The infrastructure required to enable all wireless and modern digital information flow. Any information flow that seems to happen through the air, such as cell phone calls, internet connectivity, and even your TV signal. These all depend on information and communications infrastructure. On a high level, by 2030, the NDP aimed to realize a South Africa where the information and communications infrastructure would enhance communication and information flow for all in a way that would enable two main things. Number one, increased economic activity and productivity nationwide. And number two, a more well-informed, literate, and proactive citizenry. In 2012, there were a few traits of the information and communications infrastructure environment that informed the thinking around the best way forward for the country. There was limited access to internet connection, with only 11% of the population using broadband internet at the time. The state had been performing poorly with implementing its ICT infrastructure related interventions, and the telecommunications market was not competitive, with Telkom being the only provider of copper and fiber cables, which were the backbone of any internet and telecommunications. On top of this, the duopoly of MTN and Vodacom owned the bulk of the mobile connectivity related infrastructure built on Telkom's cable network, and they basically controlled the mobile/cell phone market and networks. The lack of competition resulted in relatively high connectivity prices with slow improvements in quality, while ineffective state implementation of connectivity interventions left the majority of the population unconnected to the internet. To deal with these challenges in 2012, the state committed to number one, facilitate greater competition in the sector. Number two, invest heavily in infrastructure development. Number three, improve the capability and capacity of state institutions in the space, which had not been performing well at that point. And number four, the government also committed in the NDP to create a centralized ICT strategy and plan that could guide a better focused and coordinated effort by the multiple state departments and entities involved in the ICT space. Now, let's go to the progress dashboard to look at some of the key economic infrastructure related targets that were set in the NDP and what the progress toward these targets has been to date. In the dashboard is separated into 5 main sections. The first section is an overview section that just kind of summarizes some of the insights and progress from the dashboard. And following that, we have 4 sections, each going into whatever targets we could isolate related to the 4 categories of economic infrastructure as detailed in the National Development Plan. So those 4 sections, the first one would be energy sector, related targets and progress towards those. Number 2 would be water resources and services. Number 3 would be transport. And number 4 is information and communications infrastructure. Now, in this dashboard, what we have spread amongst these 4 categories of economic infrastructure are 7 targets. And of these 7 targets, 2 of them are on track to being achieved by 2030. 4 of them do not seem to be on track to being achieved by 2030, and 1 is a bit inconclusive at this point. If we scroll down a bit on the dashboard, we get to the energy sector related goals and the progress toward each of these. Target 1, 90% of the population with access to the electricity grid by 2030. This is one of the 2 targets that has been achieved to date. We see from 2006, there's been gradual improvement in the access to the electricity grid, bringing us to the latest data that I could find, with 90.2% of people in South Africa having access to the electricity grid, slightly above the targeted 90%. Target 2, total nominal electricity capacity of 73.1 thousand megawatts by 2030. This nominal electricity capacity was calculated by looking at the electricity capacity in 2012 and the additional desired electricity capacity by 2030 and summing those together. And based on that targeted total nominal electricity capacity, that goal has not been achieved. And at the current moment, the electricity capacity is about 20,000 megawatts below that targeted capacity. So low likelihood that that will be achieved. If we go further down on the dashboard, we get to target number 3, which speaks to renewable energy capacity. And target number 3 says that by 2030, there should be 20,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity. We're less than halfway there at 2025 with 7.6 thousand megawatts of renewable energy capacity. Improvement from 2012, when 0 megawatts of energy were being produced in a renewable manner at that time. There was the introduction of the idea of renewable energy and building that type of infrastructure in South Africa. There's been a pretty active push toward that, but simply not good enough to reach the target which was set in 2012. If we scroll a bit down, we get to section 2, which speaks to the water resources and services related economic infrastructure targets. And related to this section, there's only one target, and that target is access to clean, potable water for all people and enough water for agriculture and industry by 2030. Based on the data available in the NDP progress trackers and just my research online, I felt like there wasn't, I couldn't find data points that could conclusively allow me to reach the conclusion that this target has been achieved or not achieved. So I rated this target number 4 as inconclusive in our assessment, but I've provided a few data points that give us a sense of what the access to clean potable water landscape looks like in South Africa, at least. So figure 4 over there tells us about the percentage of South African households with access to a source of water that meets basic drinking water standards. And what we see from 2006 to date, the proportion of the population that had access to clean drinking water has remained relatively the same, between 88 and 90%. It's remained at that same level, and that's decent. But that tells us that about 1 in 10 people do not have access to clean drinking water in South Africa, and I don't think that's good enough. Figure 5, of the households with access to drinking water that you just touched on now, the share that receive it via a piped connection inside their dwelling rather than a communal standpipe or other external source. In 2024, this was only 46.4% of people. So of everyone who had access to clean water, only of that proportion of people that have access to clean water, about half of them had access to piped water in their place of living, which is, again, I don't think good enough. That half the people with access to drinking water don't have that drinking water coming into their homes, and that's something something that one might take for granted if you're not particularly exposed to that type of living. But this statistic alone tells us that a very significant amount of our population, something close to half of our population with access to drinking water, don't have pipes that go directly to their homes. And then figure 6 tells us about the percentage of households reporting that their water supply was cut off for 2 or more consecutive days, at least once during the year. And we can see in 2024, about a third of the population reported that at least once during the year, their water was cut off for 2 or more consecutive days. And I think 2025, 2026, this percentage is going to go up. If we scroll a bit lower down to section 3, we get to the transport related targets in the NDP and the progress towards these. Target number 5 on the left, increase in the proportion of people who use public transport and improvement in its quality and affordability. Figure 7 over there shows us the share of households using taxis, buses, and trains as their main mode of transport. And we see from 2012 to 2024, the latest data we have, the share of people using taxis, buses, and trains, or the share of households using these modes of public transport has gradually been decreasing. Very sadly, also with the trains, the proportion of households using trains is dwindled to close to none, and this is telling in an environment where the population is continuously increasing and going up, public transport use is going down. And that clearly shows that improvement in quality and affordability of public transport and the proportion of people using public transport definitely hasn't been achieved. And as mentioned earlier, this is unfortunate because it reinforces to a certain extent the spatial inequality, which is a characteristic of the structuring of a lot of South African cities and towns, based on the apartheid building of cities and towns. So, unfortunate statistic over there. Target 5, not achieved. And if we look at target 6 is Durban port capacity of 20 million containers by 2040. Now, the capacity of our ports, particularly a port like Durban, which is one of the busiest ports in the country, speaks to our ability to trade and exchange goods with other countries, particularly our ability to export goods and sell to other countries, which is a primary driver of economic growth. And one thing that we did touch on earlier on in this episode here today was how one of the primary bottlenecks which is hindering mineral exports in South Africa is the lack of efficiency in the railway system in South Africa. So a lot of minerals simply can't get out at the rate that they should be getting out because our railways aren't performing well. And we look at the ports now also, which are an important part of providing us with the capacity to sell reliably and get things out there to other countries in a way that drives economic growth. And we see that the target that was set for the Durban port to have a capacity of 20 million containers by 2040, we are less than a quarter of the way there with the capacity of 3.6 million containers in 2025. This is less than a quarter of the envisioned capacity, so one can imagine that probably not possible to achieve the targeted 20 million containers capacity for the Durban port. Again, not a good statistic which speaks to the stifling effect that our economic infrastructure has on the ability of our economy to expand. If we scroll slightly down to the bottom of the dashboard, we get to section 4, which shows the one goal that we've looked into related to the information and communications infrastructure category. And this target is broadband that is widely available. And what we see from figure 9, which shows the share of the population covered by mobile internet networks, broken down by 3G, 4G, and 5G, is that by 2024, more than 99% of the population could access 3G and 4G networks, while slightly under 50% or half of the population could access 5G networks. And this indicates that I think this target has been achieved, and the bulk of the population or broadband is widely available to the bulk of the population today. Well, this brings us to the end of today's episode, looking at Chapter 4 of the National Development Plan, titled Economic Infrastructure. I hope that through this engagement today, you've gotten a good sense of what economic infrastructure is, as well as the articulated challenges back in 2012 and the proposed solutions, way forward, and targets that the country envisioned for itself to reach by 2030, and what the progress towards these has been. And one point that I just want to leave you with as I deep dive in these different chapters of the National Development Plan, it's always striking to me how so much of the articulated challenges still ring true today. And from my reading of chapter 4, I think three main challenges that repeatedly came up as pressing and needed to be addressed in 2012 that still ring true today, and that we might want to shine more of a spotlight on and ask ourselves why these things aren't being resolved are: number one, insufficient public sector or government investment in infrastructure and general growth of the economy. Number two, poor maintenance of public infrastructure and operations of public infrastructure. And finally, number three, a simple, questionable capacity and capability of the state and the staff within the state to deliver on large-scale economic development and infrastructure projects. Those are things that are emphasized in 2012 and still ring true today. With all of that said, I hope this episode has been of use to you, and I look forward to engaging further in the next part of this series when we get into Chapter 5 of the National Development Plan, titled Environmental Sustainability and Resilience. Until then, sharp sharp.